Zixara stood at the observation deck of the starship Starfall and watched the small transport ship dock with their vessel. Her 4 arms crossed over her chest as she waited to see their new team member. She had been fighting wars across the galaxy for 20 years and had seen every type of warrior there was to see. The Krillians, like herself, were born for battle with their hard shells and multiple arms that could hold weapons while protecting vital organs. The Vorthons were living tanks with metal parts built into their bodies and strength that could crush steel. The Nexari could become invisible and move through shadows like death itself. Each species brought something deadly to the battlefield. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and Commander Olex Tor stepped through first. Behind him came the human. Zixara felt her mandibles click together in disappointment. Jake Martinez was small even by human standards. He had thin arms and legs that looked like they would break if someone grabbed them too hard. His skin was soft and pink without any natural armor or protective scales. She could see the veins under his skin and wondered how such a fragile creature had survived long enough to join the Galactic Defense Corps. Jake carried a simple duffel bag over one shoulder and looked around the ship with curious eyes. He nodded politely to the other crew members he passed, but did not try to show off or prove himself like most new recruits did. When he reached Zixara, he stopped and gave a small smile. "You must be Zixara," he said in clear galactic standard language. "I have read about your service record. It is an honor to serve with you." Zixara studied his face for signs of fear or nervousness, but found none. Most beings were at least a little intimidated when they first met a Krillian warrior. Her kind stood nearly 7 feet tall, and their faces were not designed to look friendly. Jake just waited patiently for her response. "Human," she said finally. "I hope you can keep up." Jake nodded. "I will do my best." Commander Tor showed Jake to his quarters and then called the team together for training exercises. The ship had a full combat deck where they could practice with weapons and test their skills against holographic enemies. Zixara had run these drills hundreds of times and knew exactly what each team member could do. Grox the Vorthan could punch through reinforced steel plates with his cybernetic arms. Silith the Nexari could disappear completely and reappear behind targets before they knew what happened. The other Krillians on the team could each handle 3 different weapons at the same time, while their natural armor deflected incoming fire. Jake stepped up to the combat zone with a standard plasma rifle and basic body armor. The holographic enemies appeared around him and began their attack patterns. Zixara watched as the human moved through the exercise. He was not slow, but he was not particularly fast either. His aim was good, but not exceptional. He followed proper cover techniques and completed the course without getting hit too many times. "Adequate," Commander Tor announced when the exercise ended. "Martinez, you will need to work on your reaction speed, but your fundamentals are solid." After training, Zixara found herself walking beside Jake toward the mess hall. She decided to ask the question that had been bothering her since he arrived. "Why did they accept humans into the Defense Corps?" she said. "No offense, but your species does not seem built for war." Jake thought about this for a moment before answering. "I suppose we are not as strong or fast as other species, but humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We learned some things along the way, such as how to survive when everything goes wrong, how to keep fighting when logic says you should give up, how to turn weakness into strength." Zixara made a clicking sound that was the Krillian equivalent of laughter. "Those sound like pretty words, but war is about practical things. Weapons and armor and tactics that work." "You are probably right," Jake said without seeming offended. "I guess we will find out soon enough." 3 days later, Commander Tor called the team together for a mission briefing. They gathered in the main conference room where a large holographic display showed star charts and tactical information. Tor's cybernetic eye glowed as he accessed the mission files. "We have a priority 1 assignment," he announced. Intelligence reports indicate the Devourers are building up forces on the moon Keth-7. We need to infiltrate their staging area and gather information about their next offensive. The Devourers were the enemy that every species in the galaxy feared. They consumed entire worlds and left nothing behind but dead rock. Their technology was advanced, and their warriors were brutal in combat. Any mission against them was dangerous. Keth-7 has high gravity and a toxic atmosphere, Tor continued. The environment will be hostile even before we encounter enemy forces. We will use standard infiltration protocols and extract intelligence from their command center. Zixara studied the mission parameters on her datapad. The approach looked straightforward enough. Her team had run similar operations dozens of times against various enemies. They would land at night, move through the terrain using stealth, penetrate the enemy perimeter, gather the needed information, and withdraw before the Devourers knew they had been there. She glanced at Jake, who was reading his own mission briefing, with the same calm expression he always wore. She wondered if he truly understood what they were about to face, or if his species was simply too naive to feel proper fear. Either way, she would make sure he followed orders and stayed alive long enough to complete his first mission. The Starfall began its approach to Keth-7, and Zixara went to prepare her equipment. In 6 hours, they would find out if the human could really fight. The surface of Keth-7 was a nightmare of jagged rocks and poisonous mist that glowed green in the darkness. Zixara felt the heavy gravity pulling at her armored body as she led the team through the rocky terrain toward the Devourer compound. Her forearms moved in practiced rhythm as she used hand signals to direct the others forward. Jake followed behind her wearing the same bulky environmental suit as the rest of the team. The toxic atmosphere would kill any of them in minutes without protection. But the human seemed to adapt to the heavy gravity better than expected. He moved carefully but steadily over the broken ground without falling behind. Through her helmet display, Zixara could see the heat signatures of Devourer patrol units moving in the distance. She had studied their movement patterns during the approach and found them predictable. The enemy followed standard security protocols that she had encountered on a dozen other worlds. 3 guards per patrol, regular timing, overlapping fields of coverage that left small gaps for a skilled infiltration team to exploit. She raised one hand, and the team stopped behind a cluster of mineral formations that provided cover from enemy sensors. Grox, the Vorthon, checked his heavy weapons while Silith, the Nexari, prepared to scout ahead using her natural stealth abilities. The other team members tested their equipment and waited for orders. First patrol passes in 90 seconds, Zixara whispered into her comm unit. We move on my signal and reach the perimeter fence before the next sweep. The plan worked exactly, as she had calculated. They slipped through the gap between patrol routes and reached the outer defenses without being detected. Silith disabled the sensor array while Grox cut through the metal barrier with his plasma torch. Jake covered their rear approach and watched for enemy movement. Inside the compound, the team split into 2 groups following standard doctrine. Zixara took Jake and one other Krillian toward the communications center, while Grox and Silith headed for the main data storage facility. They would gather intelligence from both locations and then extract to their ship before dawn. The communications center was housed in a low building made of the same dark metal that all Devourer structures used. Zixara had infiltrated similar facilities before and knew the layout by heart. Guard posts at each corner, automated defenses at the main entrance, backup power systems in the basement. Everything followed the patterns she expected. Jake moved beside her with his weapon ready, but did not try to take the lead or suggest changes to her tactics. Most new team members wanted to prove themselves on their first real mission, but the human seemed content to follow orders and do his assigned job. Zixara appreciated his discipline even if she still questioned his combat effectiveness. They reached the building and Zixara used her electronic tools to bypass the door locks. Inside the facility was dark except for the glow of computer displays and status lights. The team moved through empty corridors toward the central server room where the communications data was stored. Two Devourer technicians were working at control stations when they entered the room. Zixara and her partner took them down quickly and quietly before they could sound an alarm. Jake secured the exits while they began downloading files from the computer systems. The intelligence they found was far worse than anyone had expected. The Devourers were not just planning another attack on frontier worlds, they were preparing to deploy a biological weapon that would poison entire star systems and make them uninhabitable for any form of life. The weapon was already complete and stored somewhere in this very compound. We need to find that weapon, Zixara said as she studied the data files. If they deploy this thing, millions of worlds could die. The team regrouped at their extraction point and shared the intelligence they had gathered. Commander Tor reviewed the information through his cybernetic implants, and his expression grew dark. The biological weapon was stored in the most heavily defended section of the compound, inside a facility that their current mission had not been designed to penetrate. We stick to the original plan, Tor decided. Extract with the intelligence, and let High Command plan a proper assault on the weapon storage facility. Before anyone could respond, a Devourer patrol discovered the bodies in the communications center, and alarms began sounding across the compound. Enemy forces started moving toward their position, and their escape route was about to be cut off. Multiple hostiles approaching from the east, Silith reported from her scouting position. Heavy weapons and combat armor. We have maybe 10 minutes before they surround us. Tor was studying his tactical display when a plasma bolt struck him in the shoulder and sent him crashing into the rocks. His armor had absorbed most of the impact, but he was badly wounded and barely conscious. Zixara found herself in command of the mission with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. She looked at the tactical situation and calculated their options. They could fight their way to the extraction point, but would probably lose half the team in the process. They could try to hide until the search passed, but the Devourers had sensors that would eventually find them. Or they could withdraw immediately and abandon the mission to save the lives of her soldiers. None of the choices were good, but Zixara had faced similar decisions before. The mission came first, and the weapon had to be stopped no matter what the cost. She was about to order a fighting withdrawal when Jake spoke up quietly. There is another option, he said while studying the compound layout on his data pad. We could go after the weapon directly. Zixara stared at him. That facility is surrounded by energy shields and automated defense systems. The intelligence shows at least 50 enemy guards and heavy weapons emplacements. It would be suicide. Jake nodded calmly. Probably, but the Devourers are expecting us to try to escape now that the alarms are sounding. They will focus their forces on the perimeter and the extraction points. The weapon storage facility might actually be less defended right now than it will be later. That makes no sense, Zixara said. No military commander would leave their most important asset undefended during an alert. No rational military commander would, Jake agreed. But sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to do something that makes no sense at all. The sound of approaching enemy vehicles was getting closer, and Zixara had to make a decision quickly. Every tactical manual and piece of military training she had ever received told her that Jake's suggestion was madness. But something in his calm confidence made her hesitate. Maybe it was time to see what humans could really do. Zixara crouched behind the rocky outcrop and stared at Jake as if he had lost his mind. The weapons storage facility sat in the center of the Devourer compound, like a metal fortress surrounded by enough firepower to destroy a small army. Energy. Barriers flickered around its perimeter while automated gun turrets tracked back and forth searching for targets. Elite Devourer guards in powered armor patrolled the area with weapons that could cut through tank armor. You want us to attack? That, she said, pointing at the facility. Directly. Jake was studying the compound through his scope and making notes on his data pad. He seemed completely calm, despite the fact that enemy search teams were getting closer to their position with each passing minute. I have been watching their patrol patterns since we arrived. The Devourers are very organized and very predictable. Predictable. Enough to get us all killed, Grox muttered as he checked his weapons. The Vorthon had taken shrapnel in his left arm, but was still functional for combat. Maybe, Jake said, but predictable in a way we can use. Look at how they have positioned their defenses. He showed them his datapad where he had mapped out the guard rotations and weapon placements around the facility. Zixara studied the information and saw exactly what she expected to see. Overlapping fields of fire, multiple backup systems, redundant security protocols. The Devourers had built their defenses assuming that any attack would follow logical military doctrine. They are prepared for every reasonable approach, Jake continued. Stealth infiltration from the weak points, direct assault on the main entrance, diversionary attacks to split their attention, all the tactics that make sense. Because those are the tactics that work, Zixara said. There is a reason military doctrine exists. It is based on thousands of years of combat experience across dozens of species. Jake nodded. But what if we do something that does not make sense? Something so unreasonable that they have not prepared for it because no sane commander would ever try it? Silith materialized beside them, like a shadow given form. Enemy patrols are moving to surround this area. We have perhaps 5 minutes before they find us. Zixara felt the weight of command pressing down on her. Commander Tor was unconscious and bleeding while enemy forces closed in from all directions. She had to choose between a tactical withdrawal that would save her team but leave the biological weapon in enemy hands, or a suicidal assault that would probably get them all killed. "Explain your plan," she said to Jake. The human pointed to the heavily defended main gate of the facility. "We attack there. Straight up the middle with no stealth and no subtlety." "That is the most heavily defended approach," Zixara protested. "It has overlapping energy barriers, automated weapons, and at least 20 guards in powered armor." "Exactly," Jake said, "which is why they will not expect it. The Devourers have built their entire defense around the assumption that enemies will try to avoid their strongest points. But what if we do the opposite?" He showed her detailed calculations on his datapad. Guard rotation schedules, weapon recharge cycles, communication protocols. Jake had been studying the enemy defenses with the same intensity that Zixara used to analyze battlefield tactics, but instead of looking for weaknesses to exploit, he had been mapping their strengths. The main gate defenses are powerful, but they are also automated, he explained. The systems follow programmed responses based on threat assessment algorithms. If we approach from an unexpected angle at the wrong time using the wrong tactics, we can confuse their targeting systems long enough to get inside. Zixara looked at the numbers and felt her mind reeling. Jake was proposing to use the enemy's own defensive strength against them by deliberately triggering responses that would create temporary gaps in their coverage. It was like trying to solve a puzzle by breaking all the pieces and putting them back together in the wrong order. "This is insane," she said. "Yes," Jake agreed. "But it might work. And right now, insane might be our only option." The sound of enemy vehicles was getting closer, and Zixara could see searchlights sweeping across the rocky terrain around their position. In another few minutes, the Devourers would find them, and the choice would be made for her. Fight a losing battle here among the rocks or try something that had never been attempted before. She thought about her 20 years of military service and all the battles she had won using proper tactics and careful planning. Then she thought about the biological weapon that could destroy millions of worlds if the Devourers were allowed to deploy it. Sometimes a soldier had to choose between following orders and doing what was right. "Show me exactly how this works," she said. Jake spread out a detailed map of the facility and began explaining his plan. It involved approaching the main gate from the most exposed angle possible while making no attempt to hide their presence. They would trigger the automated defenses deliberately and then use the predictable response patterns to create openings in the energy barriers. "The key is timing," he said. "We have to move fast enough to stay ahead of their targeting systems, but slow enough to let them lock onto us at exactly the right moments. If we are off by even a few seconds, the whole thing falls apart." Zixara studied the plan and tried to find flaws in the logic. Everything Jake was suggesting violated basic military principles. No cover, no stealth, no backup plan if things went wrong. It was the kind of approach that would get an officer court-martialed in any civilized military force. But as she looked at the numbers, she began to see the twisted genius behind it. The Devourers had built their defenses to counter logical attacks from logical enemies. They had not prepared for someone who would deliberately do everything wrong at exactly the right time. "This could actually work," Silith said quietly. The Nexari had been studying the plan over Zixara's shoulder. "It is completely mad, but the mathematics are sound." Grox was less convinced. "You want us to run straight at their biggest guns and hope they miss?" "Not miss," Jake corrected. "Hit exactly where we want them to hit so we can be somewhere else when they do." Enemy searchlights swept past their hiding place, and Zixara knew they were out of time. She looked at each member of her team and saw the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt herself. They were about to attempt something that no military force in galactic history had ever tried before. "All right, human," she said. "Show us how your species fights." Jake took point as the team moved out of their hiding place and began advancing toward the most heavily defended section of the Devourer compound. Zixara followed close behind him, with her weapons ready and her mind racing through all the ways. This plan could go wrong. Every instinct she had developed over 20 years of warfare was screaming at her to find cover and approach the target using stealth and caution. Instead, they were walking directly toward the main gate like they were out for an evening stroll. The first automated turret detected them when they were still 200 meters away. Alarm klaxons began sounding across the compound, and targeting lasers swept over their position. Jake checked his timing device and made a small adjustment to their approach angle. "Energy barrier dropping in 15 seconds, he said calmly into his comm unit. "Be ready to move on my signal." Zixara watched the defensive systems activate exactly as Jake had predicted. The Devourers had programmed their automated defenses to respond to different threat levels with predetermined tactical algorithms. A small infiltration team approaching from the main gate triggered Protocol 7, which involved a specific sequence of barrier adjustments and weapon targeting cycles. Jake had studied these patterns until he could predict them down to the second. "Now," he said, and began running toward the gate. The energy barrier flickered and disappeared for exactly 3 seconds while the system recalibrated to track their new position. Jake led the team through the gap with perfect timing and then immediately changed direction as the automated guns began firing at where they had been a moment before. "Impossible," Grox muttered as plasma bolts seared the air behind them. "How did you know the barrier would drop?" "Because I watched it happen 12 times during the patrol rotations," Jake replied while leading them toward a maintenance shed that provided temporary cover. "The Devourers are very thorough, but they are also very consistent. The next phase of the plan involved triggering the perimeter alarms while avoiding the guard patrols that would respond to investigate. Jake had mapped out the exact timing of their response protocols and knew that they had a 40-second window to reach the main facility before elite soldiers in powered armor arrived to hunt them down. They made it with 3 seconds to spare. The entrance to the weapon storage facility was protected by blast doors that could withstand direct hits from starship weapons. Jake studied the control panel for a moment and then began entering commands that made no sense to Zixara. Instead of trying to bypass the security system, he was activating additional defensive protocols. "What are you doing?" she hissed as more alarms began sounding around them. "Making it think we are already inside," Jake said without looking up from the controls. "The facility has automated systems to prevent biological weapons from being accidentally released. If I trigger the right contamination alerts, the doors will seal to protect the outside environment. That will trap us inside with the weapon." "Only if we are actually inside when it happens." The blast doors began sliding shut just as Jake finished his work on the control panel. but instead of sealing them out, the doors had been programmed to think there was a containment breach inside the facility. Emergency protocols activated and began venting the internal atmosphere through the exhaust systems. Jake led them through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the ventilation shaft. They crawled through cramped metal ducts while emergency lights flashed red around them and automated voices announced containment procedures in the Devourer language. "The weapon storage is 3 levels down," Jake said as they moved through the maze of tunnels and service corridors that honeycomb every large facility. "Security will be lighter there because the automated systems think the contamination is on the upper floors." Zixara was beginning to understand how Jake's mind worked. He did not fight against enemy defenses or try to overcome them with superior firepower. Instead, he turned their own systems against them by feeding false information to their computers and exploiting the predictable responses of automated protocols. It was like watching someone win a battle by convincing the enemy to defeat themselves. They reached the weapon storage level and found it almost deserted. Most of the guards had been called upstairs to deal with the contamination alert, while the automated systems sealed off different sections of the facility. Jake led them through empty corridors toward the central vault where the biological weapon was stored. The vault door was protected by multiple security systems, including genetic scanners, password verification, and armed guards. Under normal circumstances, it would take a full assault team with heavy equipment to break through such defenses. But the contamination alert had triggered emergency protocols that overrode many of the standard security measures. Jake walked up to the control panel and began entering commands again. This time, he was not trying to trick the system, but working with it. The emergency protocols were designed to allow authorized personnel to access the weapon storage in case of containment failures or other disasters. "How do you know the access? Codes?" Silith asked as the vault door began opening. "I do not," Jake admitted. But emergency protocols always use default codes that are easy to remember under stress. Most species choose simple patterns based on their basic mathematics. The door slid open to reveal a chamber filled with storage containers, holding enough biological agent to sterilize hundreds of worlds. Each container was marked with symbols that hurt to look at and warnings in multiple languages about the contents. This was the weapon that could end all life in the galaxy if the Devourers were allowed to deploy it. "We need to destroy all of this," Zixara said as she studied the storage racks. Jake was already working at another control terminal. "The facility has a self-destruct system designed to prevent the weapon from falling into enemy hands. I just need to activate the sequence and set the timer." But as he worked, the lights suddenly went out and emergency power activated. Somewhere above them, the real Devourer security forces had figured out that the contamination alert was false. They were cutting power to different sections of the facility and would reach the weapon storage level within minutes. "How long do you need?" Zixara asked as she checked her weapons. "At least 10 minutes to ensure complete destruction of the biological agent," Jake replied without stopping his work. "The process has to be done correctly or some of the weapon could survive." Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridors above them, and Zixara could hear armed soldiers moving through the facility toward their position. The team had maybe 5 minutes before they would be discovered and overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. "Then we hold them here," she decided. "Whatever it takes." Jake looked up from the control panel with the same calm expression he always wore. "I can stay and finish the sequence while the rest of you extract. Someone needs to make sure the destruction is complete." Zixara realized what he was suggesting and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The self-destruct sequence would not leave enough time for anyone to escape the facility. Jake was volunteering to sacrifice himself to ensure the mission succeeded. "There has to be another way," she said. Jake smiled and turned back to his work. "Maybe, but humans are pretty good at holding the line when everything looks hopeless." Jake continued working at the control terminal while the sounds of approaching Devourer soldiers grew louder in the corridors above. His fingers moved across the interface with steady precision as he activated the facility's self-destruct sequence and began the careful process of destroying the biological weapon stores. Each container required specific disposal protocols to ensure that none of the deadly agent would survive the explosion. Zixara positioned herself and the team at the vault entrance and prepared to hold off the enemy forces for as long as possible. She had fought desperate battles before, but never one where the stakes were measured in millions of worlds rather than single planets. If they failed here, the Devourers would have a weapon that could end all life in the galaxy. 10 minutes, she called to Jake. Can you do it in less time? Not if we want to be sure, he replied without looking up. The destruction sequence has to run completely, or some of the biological agent might survive in a dormant state. Even a few drops could be cultivated into a new weapon. The first Devourer soldiers appeared at the far end of the corridor and began advancing toward the vault. They moved carefully behind energy shields and fired plasma bursts that scorched the metal walls around the entrance. Zixara returned fire with her squad weapons while Grox set up his heavy gun in a defensive position. The enemy soldiers were well-trained and heavily armed, but they had to approach through a narrow corridor that limited their ability to use superior numbers. For the moment, Zixara's team could hold them back, but more reinforcements would arrive soon and overwhelm their position. 8 minutes remaining, Jake announced. The destruction sequence was running automatically now, but he continued to monitor the process and make adjustments to ensure complete elimination of the biological weapon. A group of Devourer soldiers tried to flank their position by using maintenance tunnels, but Silith intercepted them in the ventilation system. The Nexari could move through dark spaces like a living shadow, and her energy blades made no sound when they cut through enemy armor. But even she could not be everywhere at once. They are bringing up heavy weapons, Grox reported as he fired controlled bursts down the corridor. Plasma cannons and assault armor. We cannot hold this position much longer, Zixara calculated. Their remaining ammunition and the number of enemy soldiers moving against them. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. They would be overrun in less than 5 minutes while Jake still needed 8 minutes to complete the destruction sequence. You have to go, Jake said from the control terminal. Take the team and extract while you still can. I will finish this. We do not abandon team members, Zixara replied as she reloaded her weapons. Jake looked at her with that same calm expression he had worn since the first day they met. This is not about abandoning anyone. This is about making sure the mission succeeds. Someone has to stay and complete the sequence. Before Zixara could respond, a massive explosion shook the facility as the Devourers brought up demolition charges to blast through the defensive barriers. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, while emergency lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, she could hear enemy soldiers moving closer to their position. 6 minutes, Jake called out as he worked by the glow of the control panel. The destruction sequence was proceeding normally, but any interruption could cause it to fail and leave portions of the biological weapon intact. Grox fired his last heavy ammunition and switched to his backup weapons. Silith emerged from the ventilation system with cuts on her armor and reported that more enemy soldiers were moving through the facility toward their position. They were out of time and almost out of ammunition. Go, Jake said again. I can hold them long enough to finish this. Zixara looked at the human and finally understood something that had puzzled her since their first meeting. Jake was not fearless and he was not naive about the dangers they faced. He was afraid just like any rational being would be in this situation. But fear did not paralyze him or make him hesitate when hard choices had to be made. How will you hold them? She asked. Jake gestured toward the storage containers and the facility's industrial equipment. Humans are good at improvising. We make weapons out of whatever we can find, and we keep fighting until the job is done. The Devourer soldiers were preparing for a final assault on the vault entrance. Zixara could see them positioning explosive charges and heavy weapons in the corridor while their commanders coordinated the attack through encrypted communications. In another minute, they would have overwhelming firepower focused on the defensive position. Jake sealed the vault door behind them and activated the facility's emergency lockdown protocols. The blast barriers would not stop the enemy soldiers for long, but they would buy him a few extra minutes to complete the destruction sequence. Through the reinforced windows, Zixara could see him moving around the vault and setting up improvised defenses using storage equipment and maintenance tools. 4 minutes remaining, his voice came through the communication system. The sequence is locked in now. Even if they stop me, the weapon will still be destroyed. Zixara led her team through the evacuation tunnels toward their extraction point. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of battle as Jake engaged the Devourer soldiers who had broken through the vault defenses. Plasma fire echoed through the facility, along with the crash of falling equipment and the sharp crack of improvised explosives. Jake was fighting alone against overwhelming odds with whatever weapons he could create from industrial machinery and storage containers, but somehow he was holding them back long enough for the destruction sequence to complete its work. Every few seconds, his voice would come through the communication system with updates on the process. 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. Sequence locked. Weapon destruction confirmed. The explosion, when it came, was visible from orbit. The entire Devourer compound vanished in a ball of fire that lit up the dark side of Keth 7 like a small sun. The biological weapon was completely destroyed along with the facility that housed it and everything within a 10-kilometer radius. Jake. Martinez died in that explosion, but his sacrifice saved millions of worlds from a weapon that could have ended all life in the galaxy. When Zixara filed her mission report, she recommended that humans be assigned to every high-risk operation not because they were the strongest or fastest warriors, but because they possessed something that other species lacked. When everything seemed hopeless and logic dictated surrender, humans found a way to keep fighting. They turned weakness into strength and made weapons out of whatever they could find. Most importantly, they never gave up, even when giving up was the rational choice. 6 months later, Zixara was assigned a new human team member named Lisa Park. When she looked at the small woman with soft skin and fragile bones, she no longer saw weakness. She saw the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy walking around in an unassuming package. Humans did not look like warriors, but they fought like forces, of nature that could not be stopped or predicted. Zixara had learned to never underestimate what humans could do when everything went wrong.